Hi, welcome again to another PowerPoint presentation. This one introduces the chapter in Wheeler Becker Glover on child labor reform. So one of the things that this chapter and the previous chapter have talked about is that not everything was hunky-dory for everyone in the period of the late 19th and early 20th century, in this period of industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. And so I thought maybe a couple of more things should be said. The picture you're seeing there is actually the one from your text. This is a picture of mill workers from 1912, and that conveys, I think, the fact that not all maybe was well for workers. So some problems facing workers in general: low wages, long hours, unsafe working conditions, and for progressives, a big problem was the problem of child labor, and they're going to work very hard to get kids going to school rather than working in factories. Okay, so one of the things that doesn't get mentioned in your text is what then workers did to deal with the fact that they were making below what was a comfortable living wage, what they were doing to combat these longer hours, etc. And so one of the first major strikes to occur is this Great Railroad Strike of 1877. You can see there's a sketch of some of the violence that occurred during the strike. So this obviously isn't going to end well necessarily for some of these strikers. But the problems that were facing railroad workers specifically was that they had experienced yet another cut in wages. And so they had been facing a series of cuts, and this was then yet another cut that was maybe another 10% reduction of wages. So basically their wages had gone from $70 a month to about $35 a month, and when there was another cut announced, the workers were, as you can imagine, pretty outraged about that. And so workers not only went on strike, but they also attacked railroad property. In some cases, they derailed trains. In some cases, they burned railroad property. It was a bit of mayhem. And so the railroad corporations not only hired replacement workers, but they also called for state militias to protect these new workers and restore order. And what was also fairly significant about this strike, and you'll see this mentioned a little bit later on, is that these railroad workers actually communicated across railroad lines. And so there were multiple strikes occurring in multiple states. And so this ends up being also our first national strike, in part because of the national nature of railroads. So there's many state militias out trying to protect new workers, to protect railroad property, and to restore order. Unfortunately, in the interactions between the strikers and these state militias, there were occasionally violent interactions. The worst of these violent interactions actually occurs at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And of course, it's not as though the workers aren't egging the state militias on, but in many cases, the workers were not armed with actual firing weapons, and the state militias were. And so the worst violence does occur in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where factory workers who were protesting and had been joined by wives and children were actually fired on by militiamen. 10 to 20 people were killed initially. The workers retaliated by destroying 39 buildings, 104 engines, and over 1,000 freight and passenger cars. And before the day ended, the militiamen ended up killing yet another 20 workers. So with this kind of violence, a lot of the railroad corporations ended up turning to the government. And the president responded to requests for assistance, President Hayes at the time, and he sent federal troops to 9 different states. Again, that indicates the national level of the strike. And even though a lot of the violence had sort of run its course already, the federal troops then do mop up what's left of the disorder and protect the replacement workers and help to ensure peace along railroad lines. So the significance, there are several things to remark on here about this national strike. First of all, even though workers who went on strike do not see an improvement in their situation, they do not get the protection of their wages. What does happen is that workers begin to see the need for more organization in order to fight corporations. So workers begin to understand that they can't fight corporations through an individualistic mindset. Instead, they potentially need to form unions and fight collectively. The second significance, however, is there is a growing perception among middle and upper classes of these workers as potentially dangerous because here they are burning private property, they're engaging in violent altercations with the law, and so workers continue to be seen by the middle and upper class in negative ways. And part of the negative viewpoint is in part because many of the railroad workers, at least the unskilled ones, were potentially coming from the immigrant populations, these new folks coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and so that also helps to reinforce a negative view of the immigrant populations, were the immigrants the ones, for example, responsible for the violence. Okay, moving on then. So if one of the things that happens as a result of the strike is that workers see the need for more unions, it shouldn't be really a big surprise that unions do in fact grow after the railroad strike of 1877. So you're going to see that I'm going to talk about two different labor organizations. The first one is the organization headed by Terence Powderly. This is the Knights of Labor. This was founded in 1869 as a secret organization and really didn't see its membership flourish until after 1877. Powderly actually takes leadership in 1879 and membership continued to grow under his leadership. The Knights of Labor is a very interesting organization in that membership was open to all who toiled. So it welcomed skilled as well as unskilled workers, and it also then, because of its openness to unskilled workers, did reach out to people who weren't normally represented, women, immigrants, and African Americans. So this is an interesting organization in terms of its openness. What's also interesting about this organization, it was kind of a visionary one in terms of it had long-term goals regarding maybe future worker ownership and management of factories. So it really saw the key to worker happiness as worker ownership and management. And of course, this was very idealistic. Terence Powderly then was fairly reluctant to use strikes and bargaining because he didn't want to jeopardize his quest for those long-term goals. It's not that they wouldn't strike, but he was reluctant to use strikes in bargaining with corporations. Now Samuel Gompers ends up forming a rival organization, the American Federation of Labor, in 1881. The American Federation of Labor is the one that actually manages to persist well into the 20th century and eventually merges with the Congress of Industrial Organization in the 1950s. So this is the more lasting of the two organizations, and I think you can see why in just a second. First of all, its membership was restricted to basically skilled workers. Samuel Gompers' view was that the best bargaining happened with skilled workers because if skilled workers walked off the job, then a factory couldn't possibly function. They could always replace the unskilled workers with other workers that didn't need any particular training, but it was much harder to replace skilled workers. And so, because the membership was restricted to skilled workers, most of the people who were skilled workers were primarily white, native-born Americans. So this is a much more restrictive union. The other thing, though, that Samuel Gompers focused on was practical concrete goals. And here's why I think this organization ended up being the more popular organization. Because it's focused on getting workers higher wages, shorter hours, as well as better working conditions. And so the appeal of the practical, I think, cannot be understated. And in order to get higher wages, shorter hours, etc., Samuel Gompers was also a fan of using the strike in bargaining with corporations, and so did see some improvements for workers to some degree. Not a lot, unfortunately, not in the late 19th century. Okay, turning to the next slide. In the late 19th century, we continue to have lots of demonstrations and strikes where workers are really trying to make their voice heard to corporations. There's the Haymarket demonstration in 1886. There's a depiction of that on the screen here, where a bomb was thrown in the demonstration that was occurring as policemen came to sort of shut down the demonstration. A bomb was thrown. A few people were killed. There were 8 anarchists tried for their involvement in throwing the bomb, even though they had no direct connection, but they were convicted on their indirect connection because they were people who suggested that it was okay to use violence to get what one wanted. The Homestead strike occurred in 1892. This was in a Carnegie plant out in Pennsylvania. There was an altercation here between strikers and privately hired Pinkerton detectives who were brought in to protect replacement workers and private property. And then finally, in the late 19th century, we have the Pullman strike of 1896. This was in a company town near Chicago, which manufactured many of the Pullman sleeping cars. And the strike was broken up due to federal intervention. The Attorney General basically said that striking would be illegal, and federal troops were brought in to protect the trains from potential strikers. So the results collectively of these various demonstrations and strikes, because you don't need to know the details of each of the specific demonstrations and strikes. First of all, you should note that in the battle between workers and corporations, the government tended to be on the side of the corporation rather than the workers or the unions. And that's going to be pretty consistent through the 1920s. Things will really only begin to change for the working class and unions in the 1930s, and that's because of federal support for unions. Secondly, however, labor unions are weakened. Again, this is in some ways a middle class and upper class perception by the association with anarchy and violence. You know, who wants to reason with these people if they're going to throw bombs? But then third, there's also some internal weakness in the unions themselves. Many workers are still not joining unions. Partly that's because of the membership restrictions of things like the American Federation of Labor, but that's also because a lot of workers did still have this individualistic ethos, which is, hey, if I'm going to achieve the American dream, it's up to me and to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. So even though more and more workers are joining unions, there's a way in which union membership is not what it should be given the kinds of problems facing workers during this period. Okay, I just want to mention a few things that are in the textbook but are maybe worth emphasizing. There you see 2 progressives from 2 political parties, a Republican, Theodore Roosevelt, and a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. So one of the things the textbook notes that this is a wide movement. The progressives are interested in fixing everything. They're not just focused on child labor, even though that's what the chapter deals with. They're interested in temperance. They're interested in suffrage. They're interested in dealing with the monopoly of corporations. They're interested in slums and the problem of urban housing. So this is a very wide movement. They're interested in some cases even in racial equality. So that's something you should keep in mind. Some other things to note is that this does tend to be a white Protestant middle class movement. Not that African Americans or people of color weren't part of the movement, but it's dominated by white Protestant middle class folks. And again, not to say that Catholics weren't part of this either, just the major characteristic is white Protestant middle class. The other thing to note is that there is clearly a new role emerging for women. And we saw this even with the department store chapter. But in the progressive movement, it's not a role based on a radical assertion of essential equality, but it's still on this idea that women are great municipal or social housekeepers. So that's the language that the suffragettes had seized upon as they were trying to make the suffrage movement more attractive to their male counterparts. So the women who are involved in the progressive movement in many cases really shouldn't be considered to be radical in terms of emphasizing equality. Instead, they really do tend to emphasize difference over equality. The other thing that progressives really like is information. So in order to know what the problems were, we had a whole series of journalists and photojournalists like Jacob Riis, who were called collectively muckrakers because they were so good at exposing the muck, the problems that needed to be fixed. And so that's a really important part of the progressive movement as well. The other part of the progressive movement is that they really wanted to look to trained, educated people to solve these problems that had been raked up by muckrakers like Jacob Riis. So they really want to turn to sociologists. Sociology is actually a new discipline that comes out of this late 19th century movement. They want to look at people who have PhDs to solve these problems. The other major characteristic is the progressives are interested in turning to government. So if you think about the expansion of government in the 1930s under the New Deal, this really comes out of the progressive movement, looking to not only local and state, but even the federal government to handle problems that seem to be state or national in scope rather than something that just a community could handle. Poverty now was beyond the scope of a church and the local community. Poverty needed to be addressed through maybe federal legislation. And then, of course, the point that's being made with these visual sources here is that indeed progressives belong to both the national political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, and of course, as your text points out, both parties also had their more conservative elements as well. One last slide. Actually, this is the second to last slide. So one other thing I just want to mention with regard to the progressives. The chapter here maybe makes a too subtle point that another thing that progressives are trying to do is to redefine childhood itself. So some of their expectations with regard to children and what they should be doing and what their mothers should be doing them, what they should eat, what they should look like, are really coming from a middle class perspective of childhood. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that actually throughout much of the 19th century, children were often perceived as almost miniature adults. It's not like we had a special childhood that needed to be protected or conserved. Instead, children were seen as little adults and they were given the responsibilities of little adults. So children's work for a very long time had been relied upon as part of the family's economy. So it's these middle class folks who are really changing things up. The working class folks are relying on very traditional notions of childhood. It's the middle class people who are introducing something new here. Children had always worked prior to the late 19th century. Even Ben Franklin, I like to mention him, was working at the age of 10. He wasn't happy about it because, of course, he was a scholar, but he mentions working for his father at the age of 10 years old. So here's a little passage from his autobiography. At 10 years old, I was taken home to help my father in his business, which was that of a tallow chandler and soap boiler, a business he was not bred to but had assumed on his arrival in New England. Accordingly, I was employed in cutting wick for the candles, filling the molds for cast candles, attending the shop, going on errands, etc. So that's Ben Franklin at the age of 10. But there is a transformation of childhood going on in the 19th century, particularly among middle and upper class families. And this then is a transformation of childhood into this perception that childhood really is a special time of life, and that childhood now should be protected, and children should have their innocence guarded, that they should be able to play rather than work, etc., etc. And I think the best depiction of this change in the mentality then, and then the ways in which the middle class are sort of seeing their own children and then looking at the disparity with working class children is on the next slide. So on this very last slide, there's a little image that's in your textbook, the slum children playing in the street, source 6. There they are playing with sticks, playing actually literally in the gutter. And of course, the dead horse is visible just steps away from these children. So, it's hard to know that if they've got shoes on, how well clothed they are, but clearly the toys there are sticks and gutters. And if you contrast that with the picture on your left, which is a middle class child with some of his toys, it looks like he's performing some kind of magic show there, pulling the kitten out of the hat. You get a sense of really what the middle class expectation was for children. Of course, it's horrifying that children are playing feet away from a dead horse, but it's even more horrifying if you can actually afford to give your child the kind of lifestyle depicted there on the left. So I hope that's helpful, and good luck reading the chapter and posting to your discussion forum, etc.